So we're no strangers to BMW motorcycles on this channel. We've had the R1250 RT recently, the R18, the R18 Classic, the Urban GS, the proper R9T as well, the sporty one. So needless to say, I've had plenty of time in the saddle on Beamers, but I've been saving myself for the proper big full-fat GS. BMW lent me this one for a couple of weeks, but previous to that, you know, the 1150 or 1200 GSs, I've never ridden them. Now, part of the reason is that we used to live in London, and I didn't think I could really do it justice on like urban roads, and even the roads around London aren't particularly adventurous. But now that we've moved to like the Bristol area, we're just over the bridge from South Wales, and I think this is the perfect testing ground for a big adventure bike like this. As I've said previously, you know, you expect them to be proper good all-rounders, so touring, motorway work, a bit of fun on the twisties, and also able to take on a bit of gravel or rougher surfaces. Around here you've got plenty of that stuff, plenty of great B roads, and you even have to do a bit of motorway across the bridge to get out here. And look, I really wanted to give it a proper good test because this is by far and away the best-selling motorcycle in the UK by a huge stretch. So the GS Adventure last year and like plenty of years previous is the top seller. The GS in its standard form like this, the second most popular, and then after that in third, it's the Royal Enfield Interceptor 650. Now that's pretty mad that the top two sellers are essentially the same bike in a different spec. And so if you combine them, there's over double the sales of the third place bike. And keeping in mind as well that the Royal Enfield Interceptor is built to a price, so you'd expect it to sell in higher volumes. This bike and the GS Adventure, by the time they've left the dealer and been spec'd up with all manner of accessories, you know, you're looking at 3 or 4 times the value of the Interceptor. This 1250 GS with the triple black and the spoke wheels and the option 719 stuff and all sorts of extras, and it's just shy of 21 grand. That's a heck of a lot of money for a bike, so it's either exceptionally good or BMW are doing some magic in the marketing department. And look, after 2 weeks of riding it, or maybe like 5 minutes after I got on it, you know, I was pretty much decided it is that good. So in this video, I'm going to go through a few of the features that I just think make this an incredible all-rounder of a bike. Now, number one has to be the comfort levels. I rode the Urban GS over to BMW to pick this up. I swapped the bikes back to back. 2 or 2.5 hours on the Urban GS on the motorway, you know, it starts to take its toll. I was so happy to get on this, and yeah, I made it back in one leg with no stops, no problems. Absolutely no discomfort just hammering out the miles on the motorway on this bike. Now, the gold standards for me of like motorway riding would be the RT. I tried that recently. I'll link to that video in the description because it's just serene in the cockpit even when you're doing 70 or 80. And then also I had the Goldwing last year. Again, beautiful bike to ride on the motorway. And when you look at this, it looks a lot more compact in the windscreen and the wind protection. So to be honest, I wasn't expecting it to be as quiet or comfortable. But honestly, I think it's about 95% there in terms of the comfort that the RT delivers on the motorway. Sure, you don't have the kind of like big wind protection at the sides here, but the handguards do a decent job. And this screen has a little cutout here. It's a V shape, so it does a good job of directing the wind over your head. You still get a little bit of noise. It's not as quiet as the RT, but what's great about that is you get good visibility even with the screen in its highest position. The tank and bodywork are pretty bulbous as well, so your legs don't protrude particularly far. And then on this TE, you've got the cruise control, heated grips, and on top of that, this one's got the heated seat as well. So it's a snug little cozy place to be, even on those slightly chilly or damp days. This seat also feels like really nicely padded. There's a bit more cushioning and squish to it than other bikes that I've tried recently. And I also really like the handlebar position on this bike. The grips feel a little further back than a lot of the stuff that I've ridden recently, and that means that, I mean, look, my back is pretty much straight upright. Now, this being the TE model, you get BMW's Dynamic ESA, which is their semi-active electronically adjustable suspension. Now, there is quite a price difference between the standard model and the TE, but I think the Dynamic ESA alone is absolutely worth it. This has to be one of the most comfortable bikes in terms of the ride plushness that I've ever ridden, and not in that super soft wallowy way, because it's constantly measuring the stroke of the suspension and making adjustments to the damping appropriately. It was one of the things that I noticed just immediately as soon as I hopped off the Urban GS and then got on this for my ride home. it was just night and day. And the Urban GS has a very simple suspension setup, so right way up forks, no adjustability, monoshock at the rear, but it's quite typical of a lot of bikes on the market. Now, of course, there's a big price difference, but if you're thinking of trading up from a more standard bike like that to something like the GS, I've got to say this is one of the standout features. And this is not just me being like new to semi-active suspension and getting all excited about it. I've ridden it on other bikes. I've got the Super Adventure S from KTM at the moment. It's good on that bike, it's pretty decent, but I did notice that sometimes the rear feels a bit bouncy on the motorway because it's softened it up in the automatic mode. And so then I'm going into the menus and trying to find like a good setting that feels right to me. But this bike, I've just left it in auto the whole time. It's never even occurred to me to go into the menus and tweak it because I've just never found a situation where it hasn't performed as I'd want it to. It's just that magic combination of super comfortable but great handling, even for a big adventure bike. Now, another big factor on the handling here is this Telelever front end. For anyone who's not familiar, you know, a traditional motorcycle fork has all the springs and stuff inside the fork legs. On a lot of BMWs like this and the RT, and it goes back for years, you've actually got a wishbone type thing and a monoshock that's responsible for the suspension duties. That leaves what looks like the fork legs to just deal with steering and the braking forces. Separating the suspension and braking and turning duties really does transform how this bike feels at the front end. What I get from it is just like a really clean and precise feel to the steering, and there's quite a lot less dive under heavy braking, which can be a massive asset if you're riding like 2 up with luggage. So combined with the semi-active suspension, I just think it makes for this like winning combo that delivers a bike that handles far better than it looks like it would. Now, in terms of the engine, of course, we've got the famous Boxer Twin here, and I've got to say, it's starting to look on the spec sheets a little bit underpowered versus stuff like the Multistrada V4, the KTM 1290 Super Adventure S, and also, you know, the Tiger 1200 is probably going to be updated soon. And look at the Speed Triple, they've pushed that up to 180 horses, so I'd imagine we'll see a bit of a bump in power on the Tiger 1200 as well. 136 horsepower from this engine, but honestly, I think that's enough for this kind of bike. Even with a 250 kilograms-ish weight, it will get you up to 100 briskly without you even realizing it. Now, the strength of the Boxer Twin for me is the smoothness. Like I said, I've got the Super Adventure S in the garage at the moment, and it does have that extra bit of power at the top. But being a large capacity V-twin, of course, it's got a bit of a rumble to it, and this engine just feels like super creamy and smooth in comparison. I think you have to ask yourself, if you're buying a big adventure bike like this, what sort of engine do you want? Do you want something with a growl to it and, you know, that character that V-twins have? Or do you want something like this where it's purring along smoothly, and when you're on the motorway at 70 with the cruise control on, you can barely feel that it's going? And look, it does have the shift cam tech, so that's their variable valve timing and lift system based on the throttle position. So at a moderate throttle, you've got plenty of torque and plenty of efficiency, but as you open it up, it will really start to give you that top end power. Again, it's totally smooth, totally seamless. There's no step as you wind the throttle on, but it does give you like plenty of power to it. I wouldn't say that I've ever been bored riding this bike needing more power. I can see why some people might choose those other more powerful bikes, but definitely check this out and keep that smoothness in mind. As for the exhaust note, we've got the titanium Akropovich accessory on this press bike. It does give it a bit more volume and bass. So whether that sounds good to you will depend on whether you fundamentally like the exhaust note of the Boxer Twin. Like I say, it's a bit of a purring sound, and I think it sounds great, especially with the quick shifter on this bike as you bang through the gears. And look, it wouldn't be a GS review if we didn't talk about the tech and accessories, and this press bike is absolutely kitted up. You're gonna have to excuse me as I delve into the full list because I can't remember it off the top of my head. So we've got the TFT dash with multimedia connectivity. BMW's dashes are some of the best in the business in terms of the quality of the display, but also the design and layout of the interface. I think it's super easy to read and actually quite stylish. I think they inherit some of the kind of styling and branding from their cars. Through that you can manage all the riding modes, and this being the T edition, it gets like dynamic riding mode and all that stuff, so you can customize. It is good to know that it's there, and if you are intending to off-road it, then some of those customizable variables will definitely be an asset. There's hill start control on this bike as well, so it'll hold the brakes for you as you move off on an incline. You've got the LED adaptive headlight, LED indicators, integrated tail lights as well here. I really like that feature because what it does is like switches off the main tail light, and that means that when you press the brake levers and the brake light comes on, because it's not always on in that kind of tail light mode because that's deferred to the indicators, it means that there's a very noticeable difference when the brake light comes on, and I think that should go some way to help being more visible from the rear end. So hopefully kind of like rear end impacts when you're braking coming up to a junction are lessened on this bike. I've no data to prove that, but it just seems to make sense to me to have that really big difference when the brake light comes on. Cruise control, which is an absolute must for me on a bike like this. It works really nicely. It's the standard kind of BMW setup, so you've got a toggle that slides across to switch it on, set or resume, and nudge it up and down by 1 mile per hour. That's another feature along with the ESA that makes the TE a very tempting proposition for me. There's keyless ignition where the steering lock and the fuel filler cap are nicely integrated. I've said in a few videos recently that I used to kind of hate keyless, just found it unnecessary, but actually the more I'm riding now that I'm full-time YouTubing, and I have actually started to really quite like it, especially when you've got everything integrated properly. Heated grips on the TE, heated seat as an accessory on this bike, tire pressure monitoring system. You've got the emergency SOS button here as well, so you can get help if you have a spill. We've got the triple black finish on this bike as well, so a bit of gloss black here, a matte sort of deep grey finish, and then the frame is all finished to match. It does look very stealthy. I love kind of blacked out bikes. I know that not everyone does. For those of you who like a splash of colour, you've got that more like Rally Job or the 40 Years edition. Go and choose one of those. But if you do like stealthy looking things, this looks fantastic in the flesh, especially because they've added the Option 719 pack. So you've got the brake and clutch reservoirs, brake and clutch levers, the mirrors, covers on the cylinder heads, the foot pegs and foot controls, and also I think on the front of the engine there you've got that cover as well. Spoked wheels are standard on the GS Adventure, but they're an accessory on this standard GS model. And like I said, we've got this titanium Akropovich exhaust, which I think looks great on this bike, but also sounds good with the quick shifter that comes as standard on the TE. I think tomorrow I'm going to make a video that's specifically about all the accessories and options and which ones I would pick and which ones I wouldn't. But I think my point for this video is that the accessories catalogue is massive for the GS. So if there are little bits of tech you've seen from other manufacturers, you can pretty much get anything on this bike, and it really does feel at the cutting edge of motorcycling when you're riding it. Apart from, I always like to mention a few shortcomings at the end of my videos just to make sure you know that I'm actually being like critical in some capacity. It doesn't have adaptive cruise control. They've got it on the RT. I tested it out and I thought it was pretty good, and it comes as standard on the Super Adventure S from KTM. It works really well on that bike as well. For me, it just transforms the experience of motorway riding, and I know that some people think that it means you're going to take your eyes off the road or concentrate less, but for me it really leaves you to focus on what's happening around you. I definitely take it on a bike like this where you're going to put in those big miles. You've got the option to use it then, and BMW have it on the RT. It's elsewhere in the market, so it's just a shame that you can't get it on the GS yet, especially like I say because it's such a good motorway bike. It feels like it's only a matter of time. They probably have to redesign the front end to accommodate the radar, but it's got to be coming to this bike soon, and I think it's going to be a huge benefit to it. I hope more people get a chance to try it out soon. Let me know what you think of it if you have tried it out in the comments down below. Other than that, and I really am picking at the nits here, but the back of the lights in the cockpit and the indicators and stuff are all visible, and it's not that nicely finished from an aesthetic perspective. Look at the Super Adventure S, for example. It's just been finished off and a little bit more pleasing to look at, and that's a part of the bike that you spend most of your time looking at when you're riding it. But then again, you know, it is a utilitarian looking motorcycle, and it does give you a bit of access, I suppose, if you want to make some running repairs. Lastly, the price. I mean, is it worth 21 grand? I don't know if I could say that the price is necessarily expensive because you get so much bike and tech for your money. The problem is more that I don't have 21 grand to buy one.